Everyone laughed when the Alpha Mafia Prince announced his marriage, but they stopped laughing when they realized he had chosen the one Omega they had all ignored. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood estate was filled with powerful figures from the underground world, influential families, and respected leaders who had gathered to witness a decision nobody expected. Alexander Blackwood, the 33-year-old heir of the Blackwood Mafia empire, was known as a man who never made careless choices. His reputation was built on intelligence, control, and an ability to see through deception. So when he stood before everyone and announced that he would marry Julian Hayes, the room fell into complete silence. Julian was not the Omega they expected. He did not come from the most famous family. He did not seek attention. He did not have the impressive reputation that many believed was necessary to stand beside someone like Alexander. In fact, most people in their world barely noticed him. They called him ordinary. They called him insignificant. Some quietly wondered if the powerful Alpha Prince had finally made a mistake. But Alexander did not look uncertain. He looked completely confident. Julian Hayes stood calmly beside him, wearing a simple but elegant suit, his silver hair catching the light of the ballroom. His expression remained peaceful despite the countless eyes judging him. For years, Julian had learned how to live with people underestimating him. He understood that many people only saw what was visible. They saw a quiet Omega and assumed there was nothing more beneath the surface. They never asked about his thoughts. They never noticed his ability to understand situations faster than others. They never realized how carefully he observed the world around him. Alexander, however, had noticed from the beginning. Months earlier, he had met Julian during a situation where everyone else focused on status and reputation. Alexander remembered something different. He remembered an Omega who remained calm when others became impatient. He remembered someone who listened carefully and spoke only when his words mattered. That was the reason behind his decision. Not because Julian needed protection. Not because Alexander wanted to prove something to others. He chose Julian because he saw a person who understood him in a way nobody else did. After the announcement, the whispers continued throughout the estate. Many believed Julian would struggle in the world of the Blackwood family. They believed he would disappear behind Alexander's powerful presence. But Julian simply continued moving forward with quiet confidence. When Alexander showed him the vast halls of the Blackwood mansion, Julian looked around with curiosity rather than fear. "Are you worried about what they think of you?" Alexander asked. Julian paused before answering. "I used to be, but I learned that people's opinions do not decide my value." Alexander looked at him carefully. That answer confirmed what he already knew. Julian was not weak. He was simply someone who never needed to prove his worth to people who refused to see it. Outside the mansion, rumors continued spreading. The world believed Alexander Blackwood had chosen the wrong person. They believed the quiet Omega beside him would become his greatest weakness. But Alexander knew the truth. The person everyone dismissed was the person who might change everything about the future of the Blackwood Empire. The Blackwood Mansion was a place where every person had a role, every conversation had meaning, and every decision could influence the future of the empire. For Julian Hayes, entering that world meant stepping into a place where many people had already decided who he was before they truly knew him. The first morning after the marriage announcement, Julian walked through the grand halls of the estate while feeling the attention of everyone around him. Some members of the Blackwood family offered polite greetings, but their expressions showed uncertainty. Others watched quietly, waiting to see if the Omega they doubted would fail. Julian noticed everything, but he did not allow their opinions to control him. He had spent years learning that people often judged what they could see instead of understanding what existed beneath the surface. Alexander Blackwood noticed the way Julian handled the situation. The Alpha Mafia Prince expected criticism and pressure to affect him, but Julian remained calm. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not demand acceptance. He simply continued being himself. Later that day, Alexander invited Julian to explore the main areas of the Blackwood estate. The mansion was filled with history, from the family archives to the private meeting rooms where important decisions were made. Most people would feel overwhelmed walking into a place like this, Alexander said. Julian looked around thoughtfully. A large room does not make someone more important. It only shows what they have built. Alexander was quietly impressed by the answer. Many people around him were focused on power and appearance, but Julian looked at things differently. He cared about meaning, not reputation. During the following weeks, Julian began learning about the Blackwood Empire. He attended meetings, reviewed documents, and listened carefully to conversations between important members of the organization. At first, some people questioned why Alexander allowed an Omega to be present during serious discussions. They believed Julian would only slow things down. But Julian never interrupted without reason. He observed patterns. He remembered details. He noticed things others overlooked. One afternoon, Alexander was reviewing a complicated business situation with his advisors when Julian quietly pointed out a detail that everyone had missed. It was not a dramatic statement. It was a simple observation that changed the way they viewed the problem. The room became silent as everyone reconsidered the information. After the meeting ended, Alexander walked with Julian through the mansion gardens. "You realize people are starting to notice you," Alexander said. Julian smiled slightly. "I'm not trying to make them notice me." Alexander looked at him with curiosity. "Then what are you trying to do?" Julian answered, "I am trying to understand the world I entered." That response stayed with Alexander. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. They wanted influence, status, or approval. Julian was different. He was not trying to take a place beside Alexander. He was simply standing there as himself. However, outside the Blackwood estate, not everyone was impressed by Julian's presence. A secret organization known as the Assassin Guild had begun watching the Mafia Prince more closely. They studied Alexander's decisions and searched for a weakness they could use. When they discovered that Alexander had married Julian, they believed they found the answer. They saw a quiet Omega beside a powerful Alpha. They saw what everyone else had seen. A weakness. They did not understand that the person they underestimated was already becoming the greatest surprise in the Blackwood Empire. The Blackwood Empire had always been built on careful decisions, powerful alliances, and people who understood the importance of information. For years, Alexander Blackwood had surrounded himself with experienced advisors who could recognize problems before they became serious. But after Julian Hayes entered his life, Alexander began noticing something unexpected. The Omega everyone dismissed had a unique way of seeing situations that others overlooked. Julian did not search for attention. He did not compete for influence. He simply observed, listened, and understood. One morning, Alexander held a meeting with several important members of the Blackwood organization. A complicated business issue had created uncertainty among different branches of the empire. The advisors discussed possible solutions, but every idea seemed to create another question. Julian sat quietly beside Alexander, listening to every detail. Some people in the room still wondered why an Omega was present. They believed he was there only because of his connection to Alexander. But Julian was not focused on their opinions. He was focused on the information in front of him. After several minutes of silence, Julian spoke. "There is one detail that does not match the rest." Everyone turned toward him. Julian explained that the numbers and reports were not showing a major problem. Instead, they revealed a misunderstanding caused by missing information. His explanation was calm and simple, but it changed the entire discussion. The advisors reviewed the documents again and realized Julian had noticed something they had ignored. Alexander watched their reactions carefully. He was not surprised. He had already seen this side of Julian. The Omega did not need a position of power to influence a room. His strength came from his ability to understand what others missed. After the meeting, Alexander and Julian walked through the private garden behind the mansion. The quiet atmosphere felt different from the pressure inside the meeting room. "You knew they would doubt you," Alexander said. Julian nodded. "Yes. And you still spoke." Julian looked toward the flowers along the path. "If something can help, staying silent does not make sense." Alexander respected that answer. Many people around him wanted recognition before offering anything valuable. Julian was the opposite. He cared more about solving problems than receiving praise. As the weeks passed, more members of the Blackwood organization began changing their opinions. They still respected Alexander because of his leadership, but they started respecting Julian because of his actions. The Omega who had been considered unimportant was becoming someone they could not ignore. However, while the people inside the Blackwood mansion were slowly discovering Julian's true character, a hidden group outside the empire was reaching a different conclusion. The Assassin Guild had continued observing Alexander's choices. They studied his relationships, his decisions, and the changes happening around him. When they saw Julian becoming more involved, they believed they had confirmed their suspicion. They thought Julian was the reason Alexander had become distracted. They thought the Omega beside him was a weakness created by emotion. They did not understand what Alexander already knew. Julian was not a weakness. He was the person who helped Alexander see situations more clearly than ever before. That evening, Alexander stood with Julian on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights below reflected across the glass, creating a peaceful moment away from the pressure of their world. "They still underestimate you," Alexander said. Julian smiled softly. "People usually underestimate what they do not understand." Alexander looked at him and realized something important. The world saw Julian as someone who needed protection, but Alexander saw someone who had been quietly protecting him in ways nobody noticed. The atmosphere around the Blackwood Empire began to change as more people realized that Julian Hayes was not the person they had expected. The same individuals who once questioned Alexander Blackwood's decision were now paying closer attention to the Omega beside him. They still did not know everything about Julian, but they could no longer deny that he brought something valuable to the organization. However, outside the Blackwood mansion, a different group was watching these changes with growing interest. The Assassin Guild had spent years studying powerful figures across different territories. They understood that influence was not only built through strength, but also through trust, reputation, and relationships. When they saw Alexander becoming more open with Julian, they believed they had discovered a weakness. They assumed that the Alpha Mafia Prince had allowed his emotions to affect his judgment. They believed Julian was the easiest way to create uncertainty within the Blackwood Empire. Inside the mansion, Alexander noticed unusual patterns. Certain pieces of information arrived later than expected. Some reports contained small inconsistencies. Nothing seemed serious on its own, but together they created a clear picture. Alexander had learned throughout his life that the biggest problems often began with details people ignored. When he shared his concerns with Julian, he expected the Omega to simply listen. Instead, Julian asked thoughtful questions that revealed another perspective. "What if they want us to focus on the wrong problem?" Julian asked. Alexander looked at him carefully. "Explain." Julian studied the documents in front of them. Someone is not only trying to create confusion. They want people inside the organization to lose confidence in their own decisions. Alexander remained silent for a moment. He realized Julian had identified something deeper. The goal was not just information. It was trust. The Assassin Guild understood that a strong organization could become uncertain if the people inside it stopped believing in each other. But they had overlooked one important factor. Alexander and Julian were no longer separated by doubt. Their connection had grown stronger because they faced challenges together. Later that evening, Alexander invited Julian to a private meeting with several senior members of the Blackwood Empire. Some were surprised to see Julian included, but this time, fewer people questioned his presence. They had already witnessed his ability to understand complex situations. Julian spoke calmly and explained his thoughts. He did not try to control the conversation. He did not attempt to prove he was better than anyone else. He simply offered another way to look at the problem. After the meeting, one of the senior members admitted that they had misunderstood Julian. They had judged him based on assumptions rather than reality. Julian accepted the words with a quiet smile. He had spent too many years being defined by other people's opinions. He did not need everyone to change overnight. He only needed the truth to have a chance to be seen. As the night continued, Alexander stood beside Julian near the mansion entrance. The city lights surrounded them, creating a calm moment after a difficult day. "You know they will continue testing us," Alexander said. Julian looked ahead. "I know. Are you afraid?" Alexander asked. Julian thought carefully before answering. "I was afraid of being seen as worthless. I am not afraid of being seen now." Alexander understood the meaning behind those words. Julian was no longer the Omega who wondered if he belonged beside him. He was someone who knew his own value. Meanwhile, the Assassin Guild continued believing they had found the perfect weakness of the Blackwood Empire. They did not realize they had misunderstood the entire situation. The person they underestimated was the very reason Alexander had become harder to deceive than ever before. The days following the discovery of the Assassin Guild's hidden plans brought a new atmosphere to the Blackwood Empire. The people inside the organization were no longer only focused on Alexander Blackwood's power. They had started paying attention to the person standing beside him. Julian Hayes had become a mystery that many wanted to understand. The Omega who was once dismissed as insignificant had slowly become someone whose opinions carried weight. However, Julian himself did not feel different. He was still the same person who preferred listening before speaking and understanding before judging. The difference was that now, more people were willing to listen. Alexander noticed this change more than anyone. He had spent years surrounded by individuals who wanted to impress him, but Julian never tried to gain his approval through empty words. He simply offered honesty. One afternoon, Alexander brought Julian into the private archives of the Blackwood mansion. The room contained years of family records, business information, and historical documents that few people were allowed to access. "Why are you showing me this?" Julian asked. Alexander looked through the shelves. "Because I want you to understand everything that affects our future." Julian was quiet for a moment. He realized that Alexander was not just sharing information. He was showing trust. For someone like Alexander, who had always carried responsibility alone, that trust meant something important. While reviewing the archives, Julian discovered several old records connected to past conflicts between powerful families. The information seemed unrelated at first, but Julian noticed a pattern. Certain events throughout the years had created opportunities for hidden groups to influence decisions. He carefully explained his thoughts to Alexander. "They do not create chaos immediately," Julian said. "They wait until people become uncertain. Then they use that uncertainty to control the situation." Alexander listened carefully. He knew Julian was describing more than the current problem. He was explaining the method behind the Assassin Guild's actions. That evening, Alexander invited several trusted members of the organization to discuss Julian's findings. This time, nobody questioned why Julian was present. They had learned that his quiet nature did not mean he lacked confidence. In fact, his patience allowed him to notice things that others missed. During the discussion, Julian revealed another important detail. The Assassin Guild was not only observing Alexander. They were studying the relationship between Alexander and Julian. They believed that by understanding their connection, they could predict their decisions. But they misunderstood the foundation of that relationship. It was not based on appearance or reputation. It was based on trust. After the meeting, Alexander and Julian walked through the mansion hallway together. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than distant. "You realize you have changed this place," Alexander said. Julian looked surprised. "I have." Alexander nodded. "People here used to think strength only came from control. You showed them that strength can also come from understanding." Julian smiled softly. "And you showed me that trusting someone does not make a person weaker." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They both understood how much had changed since the day they first met. Meanwhile, the Assassin Guild continued preparing its next move. They believed Julian was still the easiest part of the Blackwood Empire to predict. They believed the quiet Omega beside the Mafia Prince could be understood through simple assumptions. But they had not discovered the truth yet. Julian was not hiding because he was powerless. He was hiding because he had never needed the world to recognize him. And soon, everyone would learn that the person they ignored was the one they should have been watching from the beginning. The truth behind Julian Hayes became harder to hide as the Blackwood Empire moved closer to understanding the hidden patterns surrounding the Assassin Guild. For many years, Julian had carefully protected a part of himself that very few people knew about. He was not hiding because he felt ashamed. He was hiding because he wanted a life where people would see him as Julian, not as a reputation, a rumor, or a tool for someone else's expectations. But now, with the future of the Blackwood Empire becoming uncertain, he realized that remaining silent was no longer the right choice. One evening, Alexander Blackwood found Julian in the private library, surrounded by old documents and family records. The room was quiet, with only the soft sound of pages turning. Alexander immediately noticed that Julian seemed different. "You have been searching for something important," Alexander said. Julian looked at the documents in front of him and nodded. "I have been trying to understand my own past." Alexander did not interrupt. He had learned that Julian needed time to choose his words carefully. Inside an old collection of records, Julian discovered information connected to his family history. Before the world knew him as the quiet Omega nobody respected, Julian had spent years learning how to analyze situations, recognize patterns, and understand people's intentions. Those skills were not created overnight. They came from years of experience that he had chosen to leave behind. Alexander looked at him carefully. Why did you never tell me? Julian remained silent for a moment before answering. Because I wanted to know if you valued me without knowing everything I could do. The answer surprised Alexander. He understood immediately. Julian had not been searching for approval. He had been searching for something much more meaningful. He wanted to know if someone could see his worth before discovering his abilities. Alexander stepped closer and said, I chose you before I knew any of this. Those words carried more meaning than Julian expected. For so long, he believed people only respected what they could see. But Alexander had done the opposite. He had believed in him before anyone else understood him. The next day, Julian joined Alexander during an important discussion inside the Blackwood mansion. This time, he no longer sat quietly in the background. He shared his thoughts openly and explained what he believed the Assassin Guild was trying to achieve. They were not simply watching the Empire. They were trying to understand how the people inside it made decisions. They believed trust could be weakened if they created enough uncertainty. But they had misunderstood something important. The connection between Alexander and Julian was not based on appearances. It was built through honesty and respect. After the meeting, several members of the organization approached Julian with a new attitude. They no longer saw him as someone who needed to prove himself. They saw him as someone whose perspective mattered. That evening, Alexander and Julian stood together outside the mansion, looking over the city lights. Do you regret showing them who you really are? Alexander asked. Julian smiled gently. No. I only regret waiting so long to believe that someone would accept me. Alexander looked at him with understanding. He knew Julian's greatest strength was never a secret ability or hidden knowledge. It was the courage to remain kind in a world that constantly judged him. Meanwhile, the Assassin Guild continued making plans based on their old assumptions. They still believed they understood the Omega beside the Mafia Prince. They still believed they had discovered a weakness. But they had never truly understood Julian Hayes. And that misunderstanding would become their greatest mistake. The relationship between Alexander Blackwood and Julian Hayes had reached a point where trust was no longer something they had to question. They had built it through countless conversations, difficult decisions, and moments when they chose to stand together instead of facing challenges alone. But as the Assassin Guild continued watching the Blackwood Empire, a new challenge appeared. The organization had always believed that power came from control. They believed every person had a weakness that could be discovered and used. They believed Julian was the weakness beside Alexander. They never considered that their greatest misunderstanding was the foundation of the Empire's strength. Inside the Blackwood mansion, Alexander gathered his most trusted advisors to discuss the latest information. The room was filled with experienced members who had spent years protecting the family's interests. However, this time, something was different. Julian was not standing quietly at the side. He was sitting beside Alexander as an equal partner. Some people noticed the change immediately. The Omega who once entered the mansion surrounded by doubt now had a place at the center of important decisions. Alexander looked around the room before speaking. We are not here because we are afraid. We are here because understanding our situation gives us control over our future. Julian listened carefully before adding his thoughts. He explained that the Assassin Guild's greatest advantage was not information. It was the belief that they understood everyone better than they understood themselves. They expect people to react emotionally, Julian said. They expect fear to create separation. But they do not understand that trust can make people stronger. The room became quiet. Everyone understood the meaning behind his words. The Assassin Guild had studied the Blackwood Empire from the outside, but they had never understood the connection between Alexander and Julian. Later that evening, Alexander and Julian walked through the private halls of the mansion. The quiet atmosphere allowed them to speak without interruption. You have changed the way this family sees leadership, Alexander said. Julian looked surprised. I did not try to change anything. Alexander smiled slightly. That is exactly why it happened. Julian thought about those words. For years, he had believed that being accepted meant proving he deserved a place among others. But Alexander had shown him something different. Sometimes the right people did not need proof. They only needed honesty. The next day, Alexander made a decision that surprised many members of the Blackwood organization. He officially recognized Julian's role in future decisions. It was not because Julian was his husband. It was because Julian had earned respect through his actions and judgment. The announcement changed how many people viewed him. The Omega they once considered unimportant was now someone they trusted. Meanwhile, the Assassin Guild continued preparing based on outdated assumptions. They believed Alexander would become uncertain because of his connection with Julian. They believed protecting the Omega would distract him from his responsibilities. But they had misunderstood the entire situation. Julian was not the reason Alexander lost focus. He was the reason Alexander saw the world more clearly. That night, Julian stood beside Alexander near the mansion entrance as they watched the city lights below. "Do you think they will ever understand?" Julian asked. Alexander looked at him calmly. "Maybe not immediately, but eventually, people always discover the truth." And the truth was simple. The Omega everyone ignored was never the weakness of the Blackwood Empire. He was the person who helped make it stronger. The Blackwood Empire was no longer the same place it had been when Julian Hayes first arrived. The halls that once carried whispers of doubt now carried conversations filled with respect. The people who had questioned Alexander Blackwood's decision were beginning to understand something they had overlooked from the beginning. Julian was never someone who needed to be changed. He was someone who needed to be seen clearly. As the days passed, more members of the organization recognized the value of having Julian beside the Alpha Mafia Prince. His ability to understand situations, notice hidden details, and remain calm under pressure had become an important part of the Empire's future. However, Julian did not allow the attention to change who he was. He continued spending time in the archives, reviewing information, and helping Alexander understand the challenges ahead. One afternoon, a meeting was held with several important members of the Blackwood family. Everyone expected Alexander to lead the discussion alone, as he always had before. Instead, Alexander looked toward Julian and invited him to share his thoughts first. The room became quiet. This simple action showed everyone how much had changed. Alexander was not giving Julian a chance because of their relationship. He was giving him a chance because he trusted his judgment. Julian explained the situation surrounding the Assassin Guild with patience and clarity. He did not focus on fear or rumors. He focused on understanding the intentions behind their actions. "They believe people are easiest to control when they feel uncertain," Julian said. "They want everyone to question each other. But they do not understand that trust can become the strongest foundation." The members of the organization listened carefully. They realized that Julian was not simply offering advice. He was showing them a different way to approach problems. After the meeting, several people who had once doubted him approached Julian. They admitted that they had judged him before knowing him. Julian accepted their words without anger. He understood that changing people's opinions took time. He had spent years being misunderstood, and he knew that patience was sometimes more powerful than proving someone wrong. Later that evening, Alexander and Julian walked through the garden behind the mansion. The peaceful atmosphere felt completely different from the first day Julian entered the Blackwood world. "Do you remember when everyone thought I made a mistake?" Alexander asked. Julian smiled softly. "Yes. They thought you chose someone who could not stand beside you." Alexander looked at him. "And what do you think now?" Julian looked across the garden. "I think people often confuse kindness with weakness." Alexander nodded. He understood exactly what Julian meant. The world they lived in often rewarded appearances, but appearances did not reveal the truth about a person. Meanwhile, the Assassin Guild continued observing from a distance. They still believed they understood Alexander and Julian. They believed the Alpha's attachment to the Omega would create uncertainty. They believed Julian's gentle personality meant he could be easily predicted. But every assumption they made moved them further away from reality. They did not understand that Julian had already changed the way the Blackwood Empire operated. He had not done it through fear or authority. He had done it through trust. As the final stage of their plan approached, the people inside the Empire stood more united than ever before. Alexander and Julian were no longer viewed as an unusual pairing. They were seen as a partnership that represented the future. The Omega who was once ignored had become the person everyone listened to. And soon, the entire world would discover that underestimating Julian Hayes had been the greatest mistake anyone could make. The future of the Blackwood Empire was about to be decided, but the greatest change had already happened long before anyone realized it. The world once believed Alexander Blackwood had made a mistake when he chose Julian Hayes. They believed the Alpha Mafia Prince had allowed his emotions to influence his judgment. They believed the quiet Omega beside him would become a burden. But after everything they witnessed, those beliefs no longer existed. Julian had never been the weakness of the Blackwood Empire. He had always been the person who helped it become stronger. As the final days of uncertainty arrived, Alexander and Julian stood together with complete trust in each other. They reviewed every piece of information, considered every possibility, and prepared for whatever challenges came next. They did not need to prove anything to the world anymore. Their actions had already shown the truth. Inside the Blackwood mansion, the same people who once questioned Julian now looked to him for guidance. They saw his patience, his intelligence, and his ability to understand situations that others overlooked. They realized that strength was not always shown through authority or control. Sometimes strength appeared through calm decisions, thoughtful words, and the courage to remain true to yourself. Alexander watched Julian during one of the final meetings of the organization. He remembered the first day Julian entered the mansion, when everyone believed he did not belong. Now, the same people who doubted him respected his judgment. The change was not because Julian had become a different person. The change happened because people finally saw who he had always been. After the meeting, Alexander and Julian returned to the garden where they had shared many important conversations. The peaceful evening reminded them of how much had changed. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had listened to everyone else?" Alexander asked. Julian looked at him with a gentle smile. "Then you would have lost the chance to know someone they never tried to understand." Alexander quietly considered those words. He had spent many years believing that power meant standing alone. Julian showed him that true. Strength could also come from trust and connection. Together, they created something stronger than reputation or influence. They created a partnership built on respect. Months later, the story of Alexander Blackwood and Julian Hayes became known throughout their world. The Alpha Mafia Prince, who was feared by many, and the Omega nobody respected, became a symbol of something unexpected. They proved that appearances could hide the truth, and that people should never be judged before they are understood. Julian was no longer remembered as the Omega everyone underestimated. He was remembered as the person who brought balance to the Blackwood Empire. Alexander was no longer only seen as a powerful leader. He was seen as someone who understood the value of the person standing beside him. Their journey became a reminder that the greatest connections are not created by status or expectations. They are created when two people choose to see each other clearly. And in the end, the person everyone ignored became the person everyone respected, while the Alpha who once carried everything alone discovered that the strongest future was built together.